Meet Galileo Galilei, a Tuscan mathematician who turns a tube of brass and glass into evidence against the heavens everyone is ordered to accept. In Rome in 1633, at age 69, he stands in the Palace of the Holy Office as clerics read the sentence vehemently suspected of heresy, because his book argues the earth moves and the sun sits still. The charge lands, because his observations spread faster than the church can control what is said aloud, and the punishment ends with house arrest instead of a stake. Meanwhile in Venice in 1609, Galileo improves a Dutch spyglass into a telescope that magnifies about 20 times, and he points it at Jupiter night after night. He sketches 4 moving lights, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, proving not everything orbits Earth, and the observation gives him a weapon against the old model. Days later, he shows the instrument from the Campanile of San Marco to senators and merchants, and the city rewards him with pay and prestige, because the same device spots ships hours earlier than the naked eye. That same momentum carries him to Florence in 1610, where he renames Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, and presents them to Cosimo II de' Medici to secure a court salary and protection. The deal works because patronage buys him a platform, but it also ties his reputation to political theater and makes powerful enemies watch every claim he prints. In 1616, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine delivers the boundary line in writing. He may discuss heliocentrism as hypothesis, but he must not teach it as fact, because Rome is already treating telescopic evidence as a threat to authority. Meanwhile, in 1632, his dialogue on the 2 chief world systems sells in Italy and turns private argument into public spectacle, with readers recognizing Pope Urban VIII's own talking points placed in the mouth of a character named Simplicio. The book triggers the 1633 trial because Rome treats it as disobedience to the 1616 restriction, and Galileo is forced to recant to avoid harsher punishment while his work is banned. In his final years under guard, he still traces circles and measures motion on paper because he trusts numbers more than permission. But how did they get here? And how does a musician's son learn to fight power with evidence? So let's start from the beginning. Days after the dialogue sparks outrage in 1632, the story rewinds to Pisa in 1564, where Galileo is born into Vincenzo Galilei's crowded household and learns that arguments can ruin a family's finances. In the 1570s, after the Galileis move between Pisa and Florence, Vincenzo tests musical claims with strings, weights, and measured intervals, and he teaches his son a rule that clashes with schoolroom authority. If a claim cannot be checked by hand and ear, it does not deserve obedience. That habit of measuring instead of accepting becomes Galileo's private language at the dinner table, and it turns curiosity into a tool for survival as debts pile up. In 1581, Galileo enters the University of Pisa to study medicine because a physician's income can steady the Galilei household, and the choice is treated as a family contract rather than a personal dream. That same year, he meets the court mathematician Ostilio Ricci and is drawn into Euclid and Archimedes, where proofs replace opinions and geometry answers questions medicine cannot. Months later, Galileo stops paying for medical courses, spends his time on mathematics instead, and risks disgrace and deeper debt by turning his education into an argument with his own father. Meanwhile in Pisa, around 1583, in the Cathedral of Santa Maria Assunta, Galileo watches a bronze lamp sway after it is lit and times the swings against his pulse, noticing that wide arcs and small arcs keep nearly the same rhythm. He turns the observation into a practical idea about regular motion that later helps physicians time pulses with a pendulum, because a measurement that repeats can become a tool. The same obsession with motion pushes him to seek results he can show to others, not just thoughts he can defend in conversation. By 1586 in Florence, Galileo writes and circulates La Bilancetta, a short treatise describing a hydrostatic balance that uses the different buoyancy of metals in water to estimate purity, because useful instruments attract patrons faster than abstract lectures. In the late 1580s, he lectures on motion and publicly disputes Aristotelian claims about falling bodies, and his sharp performance wins students while it hardens rivals who control appointments. In 1591, Vincenzo dies and leaves Galileo responsible for his mother and siblings, and by 1592, he pursues a salaried chair at the University of Padua, where teaching and invention can pay debts and give his arguments room to grow. In 1592, with Florence debts still biting, and Vincenzo Galilei's lessons about distrusting authority ringing in his ears, Galileo leaves Tuscany for the University of Padua in the Venetian Republic to take a better paid chair in mathematics. He teaches Euclid and Ptolemy by day, and turns mechanics into a public sport at night, filling lecture halls with students, soldiers, and nobles who come to watch him prove claims with weights, pulleys, and measured time instead of quotations. Days later in Padua, in the late 1590s, Galileo stages motion as a measurable event, rolling a ball down an inclined plane to slow the fall enough for timing, then using water flow and marked intervals to compare speeds. The results undercut Aristotle's claim that heavier bodies fall faster, and the applause he earns in Venice's tolerant shadow teaches him a hard rule of patronage. The cleanest experiment still needs the right audience to survive. That same ambition runs into private cost in Padua around 1599 to 1600, as Galileo begins a long relationship with Marina Gamba, a Venetian woman outside his academic world, while he avoids marriage that could threaten money and status. Their children arrive one by one: Virginia in 1600, Livia in 1601, and Vincenzo in 1606. And his household becomes a ledger of obligations that pushes him to chase paying pupils, gifts from nobles, and any invention that can be sold or dedicated to a powerful name. In 1606 in Padua, Galileo markets the proportional compass, also called the sector, to artillery officers and engineers, then fights for ownership when his former student Baldassare Capra publishes a Latin manual that copies Galileo's design and lessons, forcing an official complaint and a public defense of priority. In 1609, as that dispute sharpens his instinct to control the story, rumors reach Venice of a Dutch spyglass from the Netherlands, and Galileo immediately starts building improved versions because he understands that an instrument can win patrons faster than any argument. Days after word spreads of a Dutch spyglass in 1609, Galileo grinds new lenses in Padua and carries a finished telescope to Venice, climbing the campanile of San Marco with senators and the Doge. On the 21st of August 1609, he lets them read ship flags hours before the naked eye can, and the Senate rewards him with a doubled salary and lifetime tenure at the University of Padua because the instrument promises military advantage. That same praise tightens the leash of patronage, because Galileo learns the quickest way to protect a dangerous idea is to sell it as power first, then as truth. Months later, in January 1610 in Padua, Galileo points his improved telescope skyward and records Jupiter night after night, sketching by lamplight 4 tiny lights that change position but never leave the planet's side. By the 13th of January 1610, he recognizes a pattern of orbiting bodies: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, showing that not everything circles Earth and giving Copernicus a concrete example in the eyepiece. The discovery forces a choice between caution and certainty, so he rushes to publish before rivals claim the same moons and before critics can reframe them as optical tricks. In March 1610, Galileo prints Sidereus Nuncius in Venice and fills it with specific claims: mountains on the moon, countless faint stars, and 4 Jovian satellites. So readers can test him instead of arguing from Aristotle. He renames the moons the Medicean stars to court Cosimo II de' Medici, and the tactic works because Florence offers status, money, and protection that Padua cannot. By summer 1610 he leaves Venetian freedom for the Medici court as mathematician and philosopher in Florence, and the same words that win him a patron now draw enemies who treat public certainty as provocation. Meanwhile, in 1611, Galileo travels to Rome and the Jesuit astronomers at the Collegio Romano, including Christoph Clavius's circle, confirm the phases of Venus and Jupiter's moons, giving him validation that feels official. In 1613 to 1615 he pushes beyond observation in letters on sunspots and in the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, arguing that scripture cannot contradict demonstrated nature, and that interpreters must adjust when evidence is clear. In February 1616, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine privately orders Galileo not to hold or defend Copernicanism after the Church condemns it as contrary to Scripture, and Galileo begins searching for a safer way to speak. Strategy, dialogue, and wit, because plain statements now trigger punishment. Days after the Jesuits confirm his observations in Rome, Galileo receives a formal blow. In February 1616, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine tells him not to hold or defend the Copernican claim that Earth moves. In March 1616, the Index of Forbidden Books suspends Copernicus's De Revolutione Ibus until corrected, and Galileo returns to Florence with evidence in his notebooks but a muzzle on his conclusions. He pivots from telescopes to language, testing how far a careful sentence can travel without triggering censors. 2 years later, in 1618, bright comets spark public lectures in Rome, and Jesuit astronomer Orazio Grassi publishes De Tribus Comitis, 1619, arguing they are real celestial bodies and taking aim at Galileo's circle. In 1620, Galileo answers through a student's pamphlet, and the dispute becomes personal because Grassi's order controls classrooms, pulpits, and the credibility Galileo needs. By 1623, Galileo gathers the fight into Il Saggiatore, turning a comet debate into a manifesto about who gets to define truth. In 1623, as Maffeo Barberini becomes Pope Urban VIII, Galileo publishes Il Saggiatore in Rome under the Accademia dei Lincei, dedicating it to the new pope and declaring that nature is written in the language of mathematics. In 1624, Galileo travels to Rome and meets Urban VIII several times, receiving gifts and praise but also a hard boundary. The Pope insists God's omnipotence means no human argument can force one necessary system of the world. Galileo leaves with permission to discuss Copernicus as hypothesis, and he treats that narrow opening like a corridor back to victory. Meanwhile, in the late 1620s, Galileo's health declines with recurring fevers and eye pain, and his closest comfort comes from letters sent from the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri by his daughter Virginia, now Sor Maria Celeste. In 1630, he finishes dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, and in 1632 it appears in Florence through printer Giovanni Battista Landini, with Roman and Florentine licensing, staged as a 4-day debate between Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio. Rome reacts within months because Simplicio repeats Urban VIII's own "God could do it another way" argument, and as court allies fall silent, Galileo is ordered to report to Rome, turning his wordplay into evidence for the interrogation ahead. In February 1633, after the dialogue spreads across Europe, Galileo leaves Arcetri near Florence for Rome under winter rain, sick with fever and joint pain, because the Holy Office orders him to appear. In the Dominican palace of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Inquisition officials reopen the 1616 file and treat a single paper as the spine of the case, a record that Galileo was ordered not to hold, teach, or defend heliocentrism. Days later, the same arguments he once framed as a careful hypothesis are reread as disobedience, and his friends in the Curia stop answering letters as his room becomes his only safe orbit. In April 1633, during interrogations, the Inquisition confronts Galileo with the 1616 injunction wording and asks why the dialogue presents Earth's motion as more than a mathematical convenience, forcing him to argue over verbs instead of planets. Pope Urban VIII's earlier request, that God could arrange the universe in any way, returns as evidence, because the book's character Simplicio repeats it, and Rome reads the joke as contempt for the Pope. Meanwhile, Galileo insists he only intended to show both sides, but the court treats intent as irrelevant once the paper trail says he was warned, and the hearing schedule tightens toward a public sentence. On June 22, 1633, In the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo kneels and reads a prepared abjuration, renouncing the claim that the sun is the center and that Earth moves, because the court threatens harsher punishment if he refuses. The Holy Office sentences him to prison at its pleasure, bans the dialogue, and orders weekly penitential psalms, which his daughter Sor Maria Celeste and the nuns at San Matteo later recite for him. That same week the sentence is softened into confinement, and he is moved from Rome's custody to the Villa Medici, where his freedom becomes measured in rooms, permissions, and silence. Weeks later, in 1633, Galileo is transferred to Siena under Archbishop Ascanio Piccolomini, and then allowed to return to his house arrest at Il Gioiello in Arcetri, within sight of the convent where Maria Celeste lives behind walls he cannot cross. In 1634, Maria Celeste dies after a fever at age 33, and Galileo keeps her letters as his closest remaining conversation, while church orders limit visitors and forbid him to publish. By 1637, his eyesight collapses into blindness. Yet in 1638 he dictates 2 new sciences to pupils like Vincenzo Viviani, and the manuscript is carried to Leiden, in the Dutch Republic for printing, setting up how his silenced voice turns into a legacy that travels without him. Months after Arcetri narrows his world, Galileo's blindness becomes complete by 1638, and he turns his villa near the convent of San Matteo into a listening room, where he dictates instead of writing. That same year, the Dutch publisher Elsevier prints his final book, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relating to 2 new sciences, in Leiden, because the Inquisition's ban in Italy makes legal publication impossible. Meanwhile, inside the house arrest meant to stop motion, Galileo's last major work spreads through Europe as a manual for measuring motion with numbers rather than authority. Days later, Galileo's circle tightens into a relay team, as Vincenzo Viviani arrives in 1639 to take dictation, and Evangelista Torricelli joins in 1641 after studying Galileo's work on falling bodies and projectiles. They copy pages by hand, argue over diagrams, and preserve experiments Galileo can no longer perform, including the principle that acceleration is constant in free fall, and that strength of materials can be treated mathematically. That same winter, the manuscripts become portable, because friends and students can carry ideas out of Arcetri even when the man himself cannot leave. Meanwhile, on January 8, 1642, Galileo dies at Arcetri at age 77, and his supporters immediately try to bury him with honor in Santa Croce in Florence, where Michelangelo already lies. Church authorities block a public monument because the condemnation still stands, so he is placed in a modest side room instead of the grand tomb his patrons request. The same dispute that silenced his voice now shapes his afterlife, and it pushes his students to treat his papers as the real memorial. That same year in 1642, Isaac Newton is born in Woolsthorpe in England, and the timing becomes a useful marker for historians because Galileo's mathematics of motion is ready for a new generation to extend. Over the next decades, 2 new sciences circulates across borders and classrooms, teaching that repeatable experiments and measurement can outrank inherited certainty, even when institutions punish the messenger. Meanwhile, in 1992, Pope John Paul II publicly acknowledges errors in the Church's handling of Galileo after a Vatican Commission review, and the closing proof is still visible through any telescope as Jupiter's 4 large moons continue their indifferent orbits.